Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Alfred Hong. I'm a member of the Friday Conversations group. So what we are is an informal group that is focused on public education for residents in Singapore or even overseas, so that we can sort of stimulate the creative thinking of locals here and foreigners or whoever is working in or staying in Singapore. We've been in action since February of this year, and this is the first time we are actually holding it on Zoom, so to make it more accessible to everyone. So the topic for tonight is called The Big Picture, which is part of a three-part talk given by Professor Tay Kheng Soon. Professor Tay is a renowned architect. Also, he's very vocal about issues in Singapore, and he's not shy about expressing his views. And you will see later in the talk that some of the information given is not particularly well known to the public. So that's why it's really very interesting for us to hear from Prof Tay. So the format for tonight's talk is that we'll have a 1 hour lecture by Prof Tay first, followed by 20 to 30 minutes question and answer from Mr. Arun Bala and Mr. To Han Shi in Hong Kong. And then after that, we open up to the floor. So if you have any questions, you just type it in the chat first. I will take note and answer you later. Yeah. So take it away, Prof.
Yeah. So I'm a true born Singaporean. Although I'm really a Malayan, I'm from that period where there's no separation in my mind between Malaya and Singapore. We are one people and one place, right? And therefore, I'm very concerned about our past, and therefore our present and our future. And this is why I have to ask this very sticky question that are we really an independent nation in Singapore? So this is my inquiry into the Singapore story, but it will have to be in three parts, right? The first part is the big picture, and unless we understand the big picture, we will not be able to fully understand the part two, which is the present, and then of course, if you understand that, then we have to ask ourselves, then what is the future, right? So this is a series of notes that I prepared in November. And so let me just start off by saying that I am not a historian. As an architect, I believe that form follows function. Therefore, it is important to know what functions cause the form and culture of Singapore, right? States are but the institutions of power. Nations, the people, are the culture and the people. You can have a strong state, but you can also have a very weak nation. And this is the specific problem which I will be addressing in the later part of this lecture. When people typically in Singapore think of themselves as a little red dot, it is to me a very sad position to take. And because I lived through the entire period of contemporary Singapore as an architect, activist, educator, I observe, I question, and I formulate. And then I question again, how political power was amassed. Why then is thinking constrained in Singapore? There are many areas of thought articulation that seems to be difficult to express. And then, of course, can there be a different social and economic and political order that is considerate and visionary as well? And that's the future, but that seems to be quite difficult. And I will try to explain why that is difficult. What is essentially concerning to me is why this immensely strong state, strong and rich state, has to continue to rule rough over the citizens. Why is it that the philosophy behind this? What are the philosophical assumptions behind the making of this strong state? When pragmatics blocks out philosophy, it blocks out ambition and imagination. And we are so proud of being practical and pragmatic, right? We look down on philosophy. We think philosophy is a kind of soft-headed, fluffy stuff. But we need philosophy to liberate our thinking, to inspire courage, and to dare to think real and think bigger. Okay, and this is the starting point. The starting point is philosophy. If you have to liberate our minds from the learned limitations that imprison us, philosophy is not just fanciful thinking. And that's what we are made to believe. It can free us or imprison us. That's the issue, right? So part one, the big picture. It's important that I start off by quoting Lee Kuan Yew, right? And he said that if you do not know the history, you think short term. But if you know history, you are able to think medium and long term. That's absolutely true, right? But what has he done to our thinking? That is the question, right? So I ask, but if you don't, but if we don't and we can't question the official narratives that are given to us, or look under its surface, how can we really know what is really happening and what has really happened? So now there are lessons from philosophy, which underlie a lot of the thinking in Singapore, but are never made very clear, right? Now, in the modern world, first and most important philosopher is Karl Marx and Max Weber. And what have these two people have to do with us? Our early leaders were all socialists. They were socialists of some kind. How well were they influenced by the big ideas of the past 200 years? That's the question, right? So you have Karl Marx, right, whose social theory was translated and became communism, right? The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848, as old as that, right? And the labor theory of value, which is a clarification of how capitalism works, right, was published in 1867. Now this is over 100 years ago, right? Now the other very important person that has influenced our thinking is Max Weber, right, who wrote the important book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. This is very, very interesting to me because the Protestant ethic is based on the idea of the rich man who gave money to the three sons, right? One squandered it, the other one buried it to save it, and the third one invested it. Now this sounds like Singapore, right? The PAP government is very afraid that Singaporeans will squander the money. That's why your CPF, they will never let you have the full sum because they are afraid that you will squander it, right? And also be cheated, right, by scammers, right? So what the PAP government has done is accumulated tremendous amount of money in the reserves, right? And they invest the reserves. This is the spirit of capitalism, as enunciated by Max Weber, right? So of course the question is that did Max Weber's ideas really influence Lee Kuan Yew and particularly Goh Keng Swee, right? Now the other very important book is by Karl Polanyi. The book was published in 1945 and it summarized a lot of the key thinking up to that time, right? And the book is called The Great Transformation. And was it known to the Singapore and Malayan leaders? I don't know, right? The marketization, and basically Polanyi argued that you must have marketization, that's capitalism, but you also must have social protection, because without social protection, right, capitalism will run wild, and people will suffer, right? So, were these the necessary underpinnings of PAP nation building? This is a very important question, right? Now, the Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi, this is Karl, right? He wrote this book, particularly very important period in European history, because the whole of Europe was being pulled apart by the influx of communism, particularly in Germany, right? And the capitalists were terrified of it. The capitalism that came out from the Industrial Revolution were terrified of it because it was fomenting labor unrest and all of those conflicts, right? And all of this was coming out from the Soviet Union, right, which was formed in 1917 after the First World War. But a very important addition to Karl Polanyi's thesis was by American sociologist and philosopher Nancy Fraser, who added that not only is it important to have marketization balanced by social protection, you must also have emancipation. And this is something that is rather limited in Singapore, right? The whole education system, the social political culture has been designed to facilitate the economy, the productivity of the economy, right? And emancipation was maybe seen as a threat, right? Now, the very important book by Friedrich Hayek, who was also contemporary with Karl Polanyi in Austria, right, was The Road to Serfdom, which was a very serious critique of socialism, right? That if you adopt socialism, right, you will end up like the Soviet Union. You will end up as a society that is controlled by an elite, a totalitarian system, and you are just a serf to the economic system controlled from the top, right? And this philosophy was totally adopted in America because Hayek actually went to America, greatly influenced Milton Friedman, the economist in the University of Chicago, who then became the inspiration for the Republican Party, right? All Republican Party members are required to read Hayek's book and to follow the thinking of Milton Friedman. And of course, the book that was the two books, the novels by Ayn Rand, right? That tremendous influence in America was the Atlas Shrugged, and the other book was on the life of Frank Lloyd Wright, right? Okay. Now we really need to understand Singapore's beginnings from the period of 1945. If we don't understand this, then we don't understand the role of the Anglo-American order that overarches the whole of the world after colonization, right? Here's a very interesting picture of the Yalta Conference, right? Seated on the left is Winston Churchill of Britain, the Prime Minister of Britain. In the center is Franklin Roosevelt, and leaning over, trying to overhear what Franklin Roosevelt is saying to Churchill is Stalin, right? Which is the head of the Soviet Communist Party, right? At this meeting, it was Roosevelt basically told Churchill, "You got to scuttle your colonies because we are taking over," right? And Churchill had no choice but to agree because Britain was in total financial debt to America because America's land lease policy had indebted Britain's entry into the Second World War, right? All the ships, all the ammunition, all the guns, and so on, were supplied by America on financial terms. So Churchill had no choice but to agree that he had to let go of all the colonies, and that's why Singapore got its independence from Britain, right? So you will see the history, right? The whole of Europe, Indonesia got its independence through an armed revolt, right, between 1945 and 1949. Philippines got its independence from America in 1946, right? India got it from Britain in 1947. Burma in 1948. China, the Chinese Communist Party took over China in 1949 when they advanced into Beijing and took over the capital city, right? And Malaysia got the independence from Britain in 1957 because of the need to contain the Malayan Communist Party and therefore give the so-called independence to the Malayan leadership under Tunku Abdul Rahman. And Singapore had only partial independence after 49 when PAP came into power, and then when it entered Malaysia and was kicked out from Malaysia, became a fully independent, so-called fully independent country in 1965. So that's roughly the history, right? So who were the key figures that made contemporary Singapore? And this is something very important to understand. Dr. Goh Keng Swee was one of the key figures because he was the one who started the Malayan Forum in London. Now, the Malayan Forum was a very important discussion group by people like Toh Chin Chai, Rajaratnam, Tunku Abdul Rahman, Tun Razak, and so on, and Tun Ismail in Malaysia. And all of this were taking place in Malaya House, right? Malaya House was a special kind of hostile situation in which all the Malayan and Singapore leaders were living and as they were studying in London, right? So they must have been aware of the debate between Milton Keynes, right, and Hayek, right, the two opposite ends of the economic spectrum, right? Milton Keynes was Keynes was interested in the balance between marketization and social protection, therefore the kind of liberal democratic order, and Hayek was totally against that. He was totally against any kind of tendency towards social protection, right? He advocated full full scope for capitalism, right? So Keng Swee was very involved in that because Keng Swee was studying in London School of Economics in the 50s, right? And Keynes was the major influence in London School of Economics. And this is a picture of the Malayan Forum, right? You can see some of the figures there, right? Lee Kuan Yew wrote a very interesting. Lee Kuan Yew was not a member of Malayan Forums, although he attended several of the meetings there. Kuan Yew was in Cambridge, but he came down to London occasionally, right? And in one of his speeches in 1951, he made the point that the future leaders of the post-colonial world had to be had to consist mainly of British trained intellectuals like himself and Dr. Goh and Rajaratnam and all those people, right? And he cited India and Nehru, right? He cited a lot of the African leaders, right? And the Nkrumah, right, and so on, were all trained in London, and therefore they should be the spearhead of the new post-colonial order. Okay. So all of them, most of them was Fabian socialists. The Fabian socialists were kind of a balance between you must have marketization, but you also must have social protection. And this is a very interesting remark made by John Maynard Keynes. Sorry, made by George Bernard Shaw, right? Commenting about the young people of that time, that if you are age 20 and you are not a communist, then you have no heart. But if you are at age 30, if you are still a communist, then you have no brains. So this is a very common feeling of that time, right? So this is John Maynard Keynes, right? Very influential person, and he was also a very influential person with the American Franklin Roosevelt, who was trying to overcome the problems of capitalism in America, which led to the 1929 and 1935 economic collapse of the American economy, right? So Maynard Keynes contributed to the rethinking about how you must restart the economy by some form of social protection investment, right? Now, the other very important feature that influenced Singapore was 1942, when the Japanese occupied Singapore. And the question that is important is how they influence the minds of Malayans and Singaporeans. Kuan Yew himself said that it affected him deeply because he saw the incompetence of the British, and he felt that he and his group could do better than the British and could take over and run the country. So that was an important moment in which Malayan and Singaporean nationalism began, right? And they were preparing themselves to take over. Now, this is a very interesting picture of the Japanese digging up the Padang. So can you imagine the Padang being dug up? Now, this is a very interesting picture because the question that it triggers in my mind is that, were they looking for British treasure that was buried there? This is something we do not know. Right? Okay. Now, the other very interesting phenomenon is that when the Japanese surrendered and the British came back, the British administration did not actually come back immediately after the war. The administration was taken over by the British military administration, the BMA. I think they were in charge from 1946 to I think 1948. Right. Now, interestingly, this is a picture of Malcolm MacDonald, who was the head of the British interest in Southeast Asia, shaking hands with I think Jinping, right, at the Padang, right? And why was it so, right? So the question that I asked is that, right, why was this the case, right? And the British Colonial Office established at that time an advisory council in November 1945 to work with the British military administration on the reconstruction of Singapore. And among the 17 members appointed on the council was Mr. Wu Tian Wang, a former a Malayan Communist Party member and a guerrilla leader, and chairman of the Communist in the Singapore City Committee, right? So why was that the case, right? The MCP enjoyed great popularity in the early post-war days because of its association with the resistance and the which they conducted in the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, which also included many non-communists, right? People like Lim Bo Seng was not a communist, but he was a kind of nationalist, representing basically Malayan and Singaporean Chinese interests, right? And then the other question is that, to what extent did the Indonesian fight for independence from 45 to 48, fight independence from the Dutch, inspire the left in Singapore and in Malaya, right? This is Sukarno, right? Very strong nationalist, right? Who invented this idea of the Pancasila, right? Right, the 5 points, right? In which communism was one of the 5 elements, right? The others was democracy, nationalism, religious plurality, and also rule of law. So these are the 5 principles of Pancasila, right? And was this the mood of the times? Anti-colonialism, freedom and self-determination, democracy, right? Despite all the odds, the overarching neo-imperialism, etc., the human spirit of defiance gripped the left, right? Did they hope for a socialist future, right? They could still, did they think that they could still create that and compromise with the Anglo-American order? This is something that is a mystery, and I think we need to find answers to that, right? So these were the battle for post-colonial Malaya was a collective effort, right? You have the MPAJA, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, right? Who went in the jungle, were fighting the Japanese guerrilla warfare, right? Consisting of a mix of British forces, the communist guerrillas, the left-wing Malay parties, right? As well as the Chinese nationalists, right? And of course, there's a Communist Party of Malaya, CPM. Then you have the Malayan National Party, Malay National Party, right? which was a very interesting thing because it spawned API. And this is something that is terribly interesting and very important because the whole Malayan campaign was described by the British and the main press as a Chinese movement, right? But RPA, Angkatan Pemuda Insaf, was a Malay, very powerful Malay group started by Ahmad Bostaman of young Malays. It had thousands of members, and there's a report somewhere that about 5,000 of these members were arrested by the British because they were left-leaning, they were leftists, and some of them then escaped and joined the Malayan Communist Party, particularly in in Pahang, right? And then the left-wing English-educated people started Malayan Democratic Union, right? In which Robert Koch's brother was one of the most important figures in writing the Malayan Democratic Union Constitution, right? William Koch, right? And then you have the AMCICJA, right? All Malaya Congress for Joint Action, and this is a kind of a mixture of left and right and center people, right? And then the British overcome all of this and created the Malayan Constitution, right? And that's why you have Malaya, right? And then independence was granted in 1957. So though identity was felt in ethnic terms, right? There were broad-minded political activists like Ahmad Bostaman, right? And he set up Angkatan Pemuda Insaf, API, in 1946. API was very radical and was feared by the British, who categorized API, RP, as equivalent to CPM, Chinese, the Communist Party of Malaya, by allegations and that they were close cooperation between the two organization in Malaya and among the Chinese, right? So the idea that the socialist movement was basically a Chinese thing is absolutely not true, right? The Malays were also very progressive, and they were thinking in terms of how a more socially just political economy could be created, right? Between the left-wing people among the Chinese and the Malays, right? And the Indians as well. So the question that arises is that why was the British Labour Party of 1945 sympathetic to communism in Malaya and Singapore? Now, immediately after the end of the Second World War, right, Churchill and the Conservative Party was hoping to win because he had led the British effort in winning the war, right? But to his shock, the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, won hands down, right? It was a walkover, right? But were they sympathetic to communism, right? I think this is still a subject of historical research, because there were many different elements within the British Labour Party, right? And it had a tremendous impact on Singapore, right? So this is the Daily Herald, a British paper, right, of the landslide victory of the Labour Party. But what has it got to do with Singapore? It had a profound effect on Singapore, right? Because the Labour landslide victory returned the British troops, the British people, tired of the war, wanted housing, jobs, and national health service. This they got from the Labour Party. And they came into power at exactly the same time as the PAP, the first generation of PAP leaders, like Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, Tojin Chai, were in London. So they were fully influenced, and they observed the political power and the mandate that the labor movement got from the people, right? And so they were influenced by that, right? So the question is that were the English educated and Chinese educated Singaporeans and Malayan activists at that time aware of the extent of British socialistic sympathies, or were they simply lumped together as colonialists to be got rid of, right? But did Lee Kuan Yew know them better? And this is the point which I think is still missing in all the official narratives, right? Was Lee Kuan Yew much more knowledgeable about British intentions and British plans, much more than the socialists in Singapore and Malaya? But the British Council housing under the British Labour Party in 1945 was a tremendous inspiration for the PAP's early housing policy, right? So you have these typical blocks built by the British Council Housing Agency, designed by British architects, who most of the British architects were leftists, right? And there was a huge group of them in the London Architecture Association School, right? And the Architectural Association School in London at the time was full of Marxist radicals, right? And people I know who were in the AA school at that time told me that they were very influenced by Marxist ideology, right? And it took its form in housing, right? So the first ACB flats in Queenstown was conceived by Dr. Goh Keng Soon and James Putticelli. And that's what James told me. I had a meeting with James many years ago in KL after he had retired from politics. And he told me that James had been released from the ISD detention. And he and Dr. Goh sat down together with a piece of a back of an envelope, and they did some calculations how many housing they should do, and they came to the conclusion we must build 10-story blocks, and that was what they did, right? So both James and Dr. Goh actually designed the first housing block in Singapore, right? Much to the chagrin of the architects. So this is a typical block which was built in Stirling Road, right? It's still there. I hope it will be preserved as a memento of that period, right? Okay. So Goh Keng Soon, 1953. Goh Keng Soon was, of course, a very social conscious person, right? And he was working in the British under the British administration in the social welfare department. In 1953, he did this important study for the social welfare department under the British colonial administration, urban incomes and housing. And it's an important document which is still available. You can get it in the National Library. And I think this book basically defined the socio-political housing environment, which became the most important platform for the PAP dominance in the early days of the PAP. So by 20th of June 1966, tenants moved into the first block of flats in the new Toa Payoh, right? The first blocks were built in Queenstown, right? Queenstown was a SIT project, British project, but there were a few empty pieces of land, and they built the first tenancy blocks there, right, in 1961, right? But the main thrust of the new housing program was in Toa Payoh, right? And Toa Payoh tenants were renting blocks of flats at $30 a month, right? In October that year, 720 flats were sold to the first homeowners in Toa Payoh. So this is the beginning of the housing program on a big scale, right? And this is a picture of Toa Payoh under construction. Interestingly, if you look at the top left-hand corner, right, you can see the remnants of the old farmhouses and farms that were there, right? Toa Payoh was all covered with this one story of flats. It was the headquarters of the left-wing what do you call it, Rural Dwellers Association, right? And they were totally resistant to the proposal to demolish their flats and so on, right? And Mr. Ho Pak To, the architect at that time in HDB, told me that he was in charge of rehousing these people, and they were very militant, right? They overturned his Volkswagen. They put sugar and salt into the tractors that were clearing the land, right? And there was huge battles on site. So housing was not a simple thing. It was a huge social upheaval as well, right? So this is a typical picture of a farm in Toa Payoh, right? And I as a young kid used to wander around these places. So I actually saw all of this myself, right? And so I'm a witness to history. So what kind of political economy did the hard left, the middle left, and the soft left thought to bring about? I rather not use the terms communist or and so on. I prefer to use the term hard left, right? The hard left were the ones who were prepared to use weapons to overtake to gain power. The middle left were the kind of trade union leaders and so on, sympathetic to the hard left. And the soft left was the PAP, right? Who were trying to kind of balance between all the different forces, right? To bring everybody together so that they could bring about a new political order, right? Under Anglo-American order. That is the important thing that we need to understand, right? And this is why the question that I raised, is Singapore truly independent? You cannot be truly and fully independent so long as you are working within and under the Anglo-American order, right? Because the Anglo-American order took over the world after 1945, right? And were the force that was organized in all your colonies, right? Right, and particularly in Southeast Asia, from Vietnam to Philippines to Thailand to Indonesia to Singapore, Malaysia, and so on. And it was to counter the communist expansion, which was being pushed by the Comintern, which is the Soviet external wing of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. So what were the leaders of the Malaysian Communist Party thinking, right, in 1948? How could they win the armed struggle, even with open front politics? Right? This is the question which I asked, and I think it needs to be asked, right? Now, and of course, it also there was a lot of social unrest. There was a lot of labor unrest in Singapore. People had no jobs. Cost of living was difficult. The employers were exploiting the workers. So there was a lot of labor unrest, left-wing agitation. The communists and the middle left and so on were instigating and so on, right? And then there was the May 13 student movement in Singapore, led by the Singapore People's Anti-British League, right? So there were all kinds of grievances that were coming together in all kinds of ways, right? And the PAP grew up within that context. So this is a typical picture of trade union agitation and so on, right? So all of this led to many meetings in 38 Oxley Road, right? Of course, I have to skip through a lot of the discussion about the different factions, right? In the different activist groups, right? The labor union groups. Why were the labor unions and the leftists supported by the rich Tauke, and so on. So there was a complex mix between socialist ideals and 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 Chinese nationalism, right? Which the Taoists were supporting, right? And of course there was the socialist club members in the University of Malaya, right? Who were also agitating for anti-British independence. So the founding of the PAP with leftist Chinese school student radicals, university socialists, and trade union leaders, they met regularly in Lee Kuan Yew's basement, and this is the table. And this is the reason why I advocate that the 38 Oxley Road must be preserved as a national monument, right? I don't care about all the other insinuations about political manipulations and so on. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the historical importance of this particular place that has to be remembered as a major sparking point for the creation of New Singapore. Okay? And this is the 38, right? Now, the question that arises is, was Lee Kuan Yew even then aware that he had to compromise with the Euro or the Anglo-American powers that be, but concealed this from his political allies, ranging from the hard left, the middle left, and his own soft left People's Action Party? Did he play them all out? This is never discussed in the. There are insinuations, right? But this is a subject which I think historians who have access to documents and so on, right? I'm sure there are a lot of interesting documents in the British archives and the American archives on this point, which need to be right and published, right? So PAP was formed in 1959, 54, right? And but was it with the Anglo-American blessings? This is an unknown factor, you see. Did they really don't know that this was the group that they could work with, right? Or were there different factions within the Anglo-American order, right, that had different opinions? I think it's not a simple question. Right? So PAP won by landslide victory, right? Was the politics of the 50s, 60s really a fight between the hard left, supported by the middle left, against the soft left? Did the soft left, the PAP, win because it was part of the new Anglo-American order? This is an unknown. I have to ask this question, but there are no specific historical narratives to address this question, which is very important. Okay. Right. Now, there are other important things that's happening in Southeast Asia, right? Vietnam, Dien Bien Phu, May the 7th, 1954. The French were decisively defeated in the war in Vietnam, right? And so the first Indochina War was fought between the French, the Far East Expeditionary Corps, and the Viet Minh Communist Revolutionaries. The United States was officially not a party to the war, but it was secretly providing financial and material aid to the French. Actually, it supplied them with a lot of weapons. The Vietnamese Communist insurgency could win against the French then, later against the Americans, is because Vietnam is contiguous with China and the Indochina, through which weapons and supplies could flow directly from China into Vietnam and Laos. And this is something which I cannot understand why the Malayan Communist Party could even think they could succeed, right? Because how could weapons from China flow into Malaya? No way, because it was blocked by Indochina, by Thailand, and if the weapons were to come by ship, they would be intercepted by the British and American Navy. So there was no way. So what were they thinking? This is a really difficult question. I don't know. So what were the Malayan hard left and middle left thinking? With no direct supply line for the supply of weapons and other supplies, what hope was there to win? So what was going on in the head? I don't know. And of course, in the meantime, American intelligence could play very rough, right? 1951, there was a coup in Iran, for example, the deposing of the Prime Minister Mossadegh, who was a left-wing leader, elected, right, in an open election, right, and he proposed to nationalize the oil industry in Iran, right. The British Petroleum was totally taken aback, and they asked America for help, and Mossadegh was deposed, right, through a coup d'etat, right. And then another example was 1951. There were many other examples, right, particularly in Latin America. But this I just singled out two, right. 1961, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, right. This is Patrice Lumumba, who was elected again, right, after the Belgian occupation, the decolonization of Congo, right. Belgium was feeding off the copper and various other commodities which they got their hands on in Congo, right? And Lumumba wanted to nationalize that, and of course he had to be got rid of, right? So CIA paid $14,000, very cheap, to the rebels in Katanga, which is the center of the copper mining area, and he was murdered, right? And his body was cut up into pieces and burned, right? So this is the feature of the Anglo-American order after 1945, which played a double game, right? On the one hand, they promoted constitutional democracies. On the other hand, they also could play very rough if they needed to. Right? So, for example, they set up SEATO, 1954. SEATO was kind of modeled after NATO, right? North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So South Asia Treaty Organization was that model, right? In September of 1954, United States, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and even Pakistan formed the South Asia Treaty Organization, or called SEATO, right? The meeting was in Manila. The purpose of the organization was to prevent communism from gaining ground in the region, right? So this was the idea, was to inoculate Southeast Asia against the communist pandemic, right? And the so-called what do you call it? The expansion of communism from Vietnam and coming down. The so-called domino effect. Okay. So this was but the reaction to SEATO was the setting up of you see, SEATO was 1954, but in 1955, right, Bandung Conference was set up. Now, interestingly, you have Nehru, you have Nkrumah, you have Nasser, you have Sukarno, and interestingly, you have Tito. Tito was a communist leader, but in Yugoslavia, which was somewhat independent of the Soviet influence. So this is very interesting, right? It's a kind of moderate left kind of a coalition, right? And this was it. This was the size of it, right? The whole of China, India, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Northeast Africa were part of the Bandung Conference, right? And interestingly, there was a very interesting aside to this, which I found out, was the appointment of the economic advisor Vin Simmons, right? Because at the same time, Vin Simmons, there were two economists who would be eminently suitable as advisors to the Singapore economic development, right? Vin Simmons was one. The other was another guy, but he attended the Bandung Conference. So therefore, he was kind of left inclined, and therefore he was excluded. So the Cold War began 45 to 1991, right? So this is the role of America over right. So 1967 was that why ASEAN was formed? Because the the Cold War was in full progress, right? So 1967, ASEAN was formed. Interestingly, we have here Francisco Ramos from Philippines. You have Adam Malik, who's kind of left-leaning, right? You have Tanak Korman, right, from Thailand. You have Tun Razak, who was a kind of somewhat left also, because he started the Felda, for example, the rural development thing to help the poor Malays in the countryside, right? And you have Rajaratnam, right? So the founding fathers of ASEAN. Although the struggle for independence was framed by the Cold War and the politics was frightening, given the powers for arbitrary detention and press control, there were ground feelings among Malayans and Singaporeans who long for self-rule and social justice. Right? So here I'm going to go through a few of them. Right? So who were the Malayans? Right? I use the Malayan to include Singaporeans as well, because for myself, I am emotionally a Malayan, right? Because I do not see the separation between Singapore and Malaya as two separate areas. We are a common people. We have a similar culture and outlook on life, right? And our feelings are the same. So who were they, right? So you have Om bin Jafar, right? Who told the UMNO General Assembly in 1951 that UMNO's objective is independence, and this could be achieved unless there was unity with all the other races, which is quite different from the purely Malay-oriented UMNO that came to being, right? And then of course you have Chin Peng, right, who was a Malayan, right, but with the kind of socialist, extreme socialist, communist inclinations, right? But it's interesting what he says, you know, after he came out, right, in 1990s. He says, I think it over whether I made mistakes or not, whether my belief in communism is wrong or not. At least I think my conviction to see equal society, that was what communism meant, to seek an equal and just society. I think that is not wrong. So although he was a communist in the kind of Marxist sense, I don't think he was a Leninist in the kind of or a Stalinist in the kind of hard centralized totalitarian sense, right? Okay. Then of course you have Lee Kuan Yew, and you know what he stands for, right? And he and his colleagues believed that Singapore could only survive through merger with Malaya, and was unwilling to call for complete independence by itself. Merger would allow goods to be exported to the peninsula under a common market. And this was a very important concept, because with a common market with Malaya, it meant that he would have, Singapore would have much more regal room, right, under the Anglo-American order, right, which would have been which you would have to be totally dependent, right? Then you have Lim Chong Yu, right, was a Malayan politician, and he was very, very deeply connected with Singapore. He was a very good friend of Lee Kuan Yew, right? And he was, in fact, he was the first person to visit Lee Kuan Yew when Lee Kuan Yew went through his emotional breakdown after separation, right? He spent 1 month recuperating in a bungalow in Changi, and Chong Yu went to visit him, right? So he was very close to Kuan Yew, right? And he started Party Gerakan Rakyat, which is a multiracial party, right? Then of course you have Tunku Abdul Rahman, right? And then you have a very important person, right? That's James Puthucheary, right? Who wrote this very important book, Ownership and Control of the Malayan Economy. So he was already thinking about how Malaya can be a more liberated country under the Anglo-American order, right? Which was overarching over the whole world, right? And they have Wang Gangwu, right? Who is our eminent professor in NUS, right? Right? And he was one of the original members of the Socialist Club in the University of Malaya, right? Together with James and so on, right? And he was one of the founding members of Gerakan. So he was a political activist, right? Even as he was a student of Chinese history and culture, right? And then you have other people like Maurice Baker, right? Maurice Baker was in London in the Malayan Forum, right? And he was one of the people. He was a left-wing, left person as well. And there's a picture of him and Dr. Wu carrying a banner at the Youth Congress in Budapest, sponsored by the Soviet Union. So they were all sympathetic to the left-wing movement, right? Although they were not hardcore leftists. And then you have the poet like Kambu became the professor of English at the university, right? And his collection of poems, Gods Can Die, was a very important contribution. And he wrote many essays reflecting the Malayan sensibility, right? And of course, you have Mahathir. So, 1963, why confrontancy? And then why Maphilindo? This is a very interesting question, right? Sukarno declared confrontancy and armed opposition to the formation of Malaysia from 63 to 66, which he saw as a neo-colonial plot. And he was right. He saw this as a British plan, right? Sukarno was deposed by the CIA because he was left-wing, right? Not exactly left-wing, but he was sympathetic. He was in coalition with the PKI, which is the Party Communist Indonesia, right? Who was increasingly influential in Indonesian politics. And Sukarno was trying very hard to contain them, but I think he was losing out along the way, right? So he was deposed in 1966, but he then proposed Maphilindo, Malaya, Philippines, and Indonesia, instead as an alternative consisting of three Southeast Asian nations: Malaya, Philippines, and Indonesia, which he called Maphilindo, right? I suspect that Maphilindo is still lurking somewhere in the background, right? So when Jokowi talked about setting up a new administrative capital in Kalimantan, right? Was it in some way a reflection in a different context, in today's context, of the idea of a kind of uniform, united archipelagic environment, right? And was it in some minds, right, the idea of a Malay superstate, right? So these are the kind of lurking questions which I think continues to exist and which we need to understand, right? So then in 1962, there was a Brunei revolt, right? Brunei was invited to join Malaysia, right? But the kind of left wing, right, the independence movement in Brunei were against it, unless there was a popular agreement among Brunei people, right? And of course, the king was in total disagreement with that idea, and the British stepped in, and there was a revolt, and Azhari was kicked out. Okay, but before that, Azhari came to Singapore and had a meeting with the Barisan Socialists in a coffee shop in Middle Road, right? And sitting in the next table was Mr. Melvin, who was in the special branch, right? He overheard everything, and that was the question is that, was that and this is the surrender of the Brunei revolt, right? Was that the reason So did the Brunei Revolt trigger Operation ColdStore, right? In which all the left-wing Barisan Socialist people were arrested and put in jail, right? So this is a very important reflection on that by Posukai, who was also one of the people arrested, right? So 50 years, I want to read this. 50 years after Operation ColdStore is certainly not too soon a time for us to speak about our understanding of our imprisonment. I maintain that I was imprisoned for being part of a slate of left-wing and anti-colonialists who were going to pose a challenge to Lee Kuan Yew in the election of 1963, right? 1963 was a very important year. PAP had an election and also the referendum to join Malaysia, right? So the charge of communism and subversion used to frame people like me has simply been chanted repeatedly to this day. Our rejection of the charge has been ignored outright and without any attempt to provide evidence or specific details which we could answer. But answer we must. I particularly feel it as a duty I owe to all my friends who have passed on. I owe a duty to all of them to describe the conditions of our time, the struggle we were engaged in, the consequences that we fell out because we were in it all together. So this is Posukai, who is now living in Seremban, right? So 1963 was a very important year. The battle for merger, right? The PAP published his 3 books in 3 languages, right? And Lee Kuan Yew gave 10 lectures on TV to argue the case why Singapore must join Malaysia, right? So, but by 1965, Singapore was kicked out because the Malay leaders were terrified of Lee Kuan Yew because I think the final moment came when Lee Kuan Yew addressed the parliament in fluent Malay, right? And he received a standing ovation from all the Malay MPs. So the Malay top leaders were terrified of this. Man, this guy was going to take over, right? So the top leaders of the Malay of UMNO decided we got to get rid of Lee Kuan Yew. So that was it. And I know this as a personal thing because the chief of police, I designed a house for the chief of police in Kuala Lumpur, and he told me, right, his own side of the story, that he was told by Tunku Abdul Rahman to drive with his whole group of people to Singapore to arrest Lee Kuan Yew, right? And by the time he reached Kuala Lumpur, he heard on his car radio that Lee Kuan Yew had made a speech that Singapore was leaving Malaysia. So he turned back. So this is a personal experience I had, right? I'm sure it's only one part of the whole movement to get rid of Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore from Malaysia. But this is what was told to me directly by the chief of police. So does Lee Kuan Yew always have a tight rational leash over his better nature? I think that Lee Kuan Yew is both an emotional person as well as a cold-blooded rational person, right? And I think there are 2 sides of this person, right? And I quote this example, you see, right, which is a direct experience on my part, right? I was one of the founding members of Singapore Planning and Urban Research Group, right? I organized an exhibition, a public exhibition at the original esplanade, you know, the seaside piece of land that parallels along Jalan Connaught Drive, next to opposite of the Padang, right? And I asked Lee Kuan Yew to be the patron of the exhibition, right? And he agreed. But on the opening day, he told me he could not going to attend because he was busy. And he asked Rahim Ishak, the brother of Yusof Ishak, right, who was a minister at the time, to officiate at the opening, right? But he did write this this piece which I want to read out, right, for the opening brochure, right. The PAP, the Spur Group represents a critical but nevertheless dedicated interest in the kind of Singapore we are building and bequeathing to future generations. The exhibition was Singapore's environment, that's physical environment, past, present, and future. It's very interesting because right now, so many years later, I'm talking about the future of Singapore, right? But in a very different way beyond the physical aspect of Singapore, the psycho-political, cultural aspect of Singapore, right? And once the back of the housing problem was broken in 1963, right, our targets were inevitably raised. The aim no longer was to house our people, but housing them in circumstances that made for agreeable community living, besides the necessities, some privacy, attractive surroundings, and unity and intimacy of the neighborhood. I hope the exhibition by the Spur Group will stimulate public interest and discussion on these 4 objectives we must achieve in our urban renewal and satellite town programs. Now, here is a very warm statement, right, by a man who could, on the one hand, he could imprison the opponents with impunity, and yet could write such a warm dedication to a non-aligned group such as Spur. Now, this is the 2 sides of the man, you see, right? So was it when Singapore left Malaysia, after Malaysia, he worked so hard to form, that his feelings overtook his rationality. And that's why he cried. Was that why he cried? Right? I think people say it was crocodile tears. I don't believe. I think it was really deep emotional upset that he felt. That's why he cried. Right? So it took a while before his rational side came back. No Malaysia, no hinterland, therefore no choice. Reconciling himself to the new reality, he knew he had to fully serve the Western global economic order. Was this the triumph of the Euro-American order over this stubborn Asian leader they wanted very much to tame? So, Lee Kuan Yew was not an easy person to tame, right? He maintained a kind of a tension between his own ambitions and the ambitions of the Anglo-American order, which he knew too well, right? So he was not an easy a person to deal with, right? And I think this is his greatest achievement. And this is what Lee Kuan Yew wanted so much to avoid through the formation of Malaysia. Is why he worked so hard for merger, which would have provided some space so as not to be totally subservient to the West. This is the unfinished business Lee Kuan Yew has left to us. So this, I end my talk today, right, and to remind people that people are like trees, not quite like trees, but have to be thoroughly pruned so that to think outside the normal must seem totally unnatural. This is disciplining, the disciplining of this society, right? Under the so-called global city concept, right? And this is to be the content of part 2. And this is the kind of unnatural tree, unnatural structure of the human being, right? That had to be trimmed and pruned to suit the necessities of the new life. Thank you very much. This is the end of part 1.
Okay, I think everyone can join me to thank Professor Tay for this very interesting walk down memory lane. For the next 15-20 minutes, I would like to just allow Hanshi and Mr. Arumbala and Alex to give their comments. Maybe the first few minutes, just on the overall comments about the talk in general. And then after that, I would like to focus our discussion on three distinct time periods. The first period being post-World War II to the fight for independence, meaning from 1940s to 50s to 60s. And the second period, I'd like to focus the discussion on the Confrontasi period, which was the super Malay state, or the attempt to build a super Malay state, and SEATO, which ends around September 1954. And the last period will be the LKY years, the building of Singapore, and that last period until where we stop. So general comments, I'll start with Han Shi. Maybe before I will start, Han Shi is a renowned journalist, works out of Hong Kong. Maybe Han Shi, you want to give a brief intro yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm To Han Shi. I'm a Singaporean citizen who has lived in Hong Kong for 20 years. In the late 1990s, I was a reporter at the Singapore newspaper, the Business Times. Then in Hong Kong, I was a reporter for the South China Morning Post for a total of 10 years, where I reported a lot on the China and Chinese economy, but I also reported a lot on China's economic interactions with other parts of the world, like the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, and America. I have a very great interest in China's overseas economic global influence, and I'm actually writing a book right now about it. The title of my book is China a Menacing Empire? Because, American politicians like Pompeo and Mike Pence are saying that China is some imperialist threat to the free world through its very insidious economic expansion. And I hope it get published next year. So what Tay Kheng Soon said interests me tremendously, because it's a bit like deja vu. I mean, Tay Kheng Soon spoke about the geopolitical competition between China and America in the 60s and the 50s, centered around people like Sukarno. I see that competition playing out again, although possibly in a different form, even today. Yes. Do you want me to comment further?
That's fine. Maybe Mr. Arun, before I hand over to Mr. Arun, I just want to do a pitch for his book here. I don't know whether you can see. Let me just put the background bit. Okay, it's called Completing the Singapore Story by Mr. Arun Bala. And this book is actually based on his brother, Mr. A. Mahadeva. So maybe I'll hand over the time to Mr. Arun to talk who is Mahadeva and how was he relevant to the formative years of Singapore.
Okay, thank you very much, Alfred. And also, I would like to begin by thanking Kheng Soon for this broad overview of Singapore history. And I thought at first I was going to comment on that, and I just realized I could not do much more than what he did. And if I did that, it would take me another hour. So I think he said a lot, he's raised a lot of interesting questions that require answering, and which many Singapore historians have yet to get into. And but I would like to begin by saying that I am not a professional historian of Singapore. My entry into the history of Singapore came about because I set about writing the biography of my brother, who was the founding Secretary General of the Singapore National Union of Journalists, and was later a political detainee under Operation ColdStore. And in the process of writing his story from his perspective and his writings, I came to see Singapore history in a different way. Okay, it led me also to a bigger picture of Singapore history, something that gels quite well with what Kheng Soon has also raised and brought about. Now, I am not sure what I am expected to say about the book. The book was published about 3 years ago, I think, a little less than 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And it's available in the bookshops, and you can probably also find it somewhere in the national libraries or the regional libraries. Now, so since, as I said at the beginning, I did not come here expecting to do any a commentary on what Kheng Soon said. Should I say something about what he said too?
Actually, I have a question for you. So one of the questions that Kheng Soon talked about was Dr. Goh Keng Swee.
Yes.
And when the formative years of building up the Singapore economy, there was
Yeah.
an influential person called John Maynard Keynes, and also
Yeah.
a person called F.A. Hayek. So
Yes.
to the extent of your knowledge, was Mahadeva aware of which side was Keng Swee's on? Was it on Keynes' side or was it on Hayek's side?
Well, you know, the book has no references to John Maynard Keynes or Hayek. And I think at the time he was an economist, and he did economics and graduated in that subject from the university here, the University of Malaya here. But and he did comment on Dr. Goh Keng Swee's policies. And one of the objections that he raised to the for these policies at that time was that they were bringing in multinational companies from outside and training local qualified personnel to work in them, but the policy was not directed as, you know, though he didn't write it directly in this way, as with Japan, Taiwan, Korea, who sent their people overseas, who came back and then set up their own companies. Okay, and it was, Singapore was considered too small and Malaya was considered too small for that sort of thing, so that we merely functioned in the capacity of working for expertise that came from the outside to tell us what to do. Okay, this is, you know, he thought that in the long run, you know, this would kind of promote a development, but not a full industrial development as you would get in countries like Britain or other places. Okay, now economics, you know, the question you're asking was not explicitly addressed by him, nor do I have expertise to answer it. But this is, you know, it's there in the book, and in the last chapter, it's also raised. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to bring the discussion back to the involvement of what Kheng Soon called the neo-imperialism or Anglo-Americanism in the 50s, especially in the 50s, because at that time in Asia, most of the Asian countries were fighting for independence. But do they realize or hope for a socialist future despite knowing or thinking the compromises that need to be made with the imperialists? So what maybe Hanshi, what are your thoughts on China, and whether were they more focused excuse me, were they more focused on independence, or were they aware of the Americans?
What do you mean? Were they aware of the Americans? Who are you referring to, please?
Okay, let's talk about the CIA involvement in the Congo and in what's the other country? Iran, yeah. So would China be aware of this involvement of Americans, and would they be concerned about this?
Well, I think China is no fool. China has its own spies and knows what the American CIA is up to. And, you know, it's quite obvious that the Americans did not like the Bandung Conference. And the person of that spirit at that time was American State Secretary John Foster Dulles, who very explicitly said, you know, other countries like, you know, Malaysia or whatever, Malaya, who do not support America against the communist world are committing immoral acts. In other words, John Foster Dulles does not give other countries a middle way or wiggle room to say they don't want to choose between two countries, either America or the communist world. But that is precisely the stance of the Singapore government today. I mean, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan explicitly said Singapore doesn't want to choose between America and China. If John Foster Dulles was the State Secretary today, he and the CIA may, you never rule anything out. They might try to do some hostile and unfriendly act towards Singapore because Prime Minister Lee and Vivian Balakrishnan said that. I'm just reminded of a Washington Post article by this Singaporean woman called Shibani Matani. I mean, she was complaining about how this Singapore Chinese newspaper called Lianhe Zaobao is becoming a tool of the Chinese Communist Party. But I was thinking, is the pot calling the kettle black? I mean, I do not accuse the Washington Post of being a tool of the CIA or being beholden to Washington or CIA. But, the tone of that article makes me think back. It's taking one or two steps back towards the days of John Foster Dulles. I attended another Zoom meeting where Professor Tommy Koh spoke, and I asked him about this question, do you think we can go back to the days of John Foster Dulles and when they tried to create SEATO? And then Professor Tommy Koh said, no, it will not happen because when they tried to form SEATO in the 50s, only 2 Southeast Asian countries joined, which is like Thailand and the Philippines, I believe, if I'm not wrong. The rest did not want to. And so Tommy Koh said this could never happen again. And America is too smart to try to pull the same thing again.
Han Shui, so I think Kheng Soon mentioned that Pakistan was one of the invitees to SEATO. So why do you think Pakistan was invited?
Well, I think both China and America want to be allies with Pakistan because of the Soviet Union. You see, they saw Pakistan as strategically and geographically a useful ally against the Soviet Union because of its location.
Okay, we have a question here from Mr. Wayne Wong. We know that the CIA is involved in various activities around the world. What is the equivalent of the CIA in Singapore? Is it like the MI6 or anybody can answer? I mean, the panelists, what do you think?
Can I answer first, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's already been reported the Straits Times in the early 1960s, the CIA tried to do several things in Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew caught the CIA red-handed, and it forced the American State Secretary, Dean Rusk, to write a letter of apology to Lee Kuan Yew. But the CIA did try to mess around with quite a few other Southeast Asian leaders. I mean, this is explicit public knowledge. I saw a BBC documentary on it.
No, Wayne is not asking about that particular incident. He's asking, in Singapore, do you have a similar agency like the CIA or MI6 that you are aware of? This is from Wayne Wong.
You mean Singapore Intelligence Service?
Yes. Do we have the
Yes, of course. It's called the SID, I think Security Intelligence Department. It's the external security wing of the Singapore government. ISD is the internal security wing that arrests detainees in Singapore. The SID is the external wing.
Okay.
I think, can I add to that?
Yeah. Alex, go ahead.
Okay, for the fact that the CIA was formulated for purposes of internationalizing American. Oh, just let me hear. Okay, all right. Thank you. Okay, I want to add to that what Manshu was saying. The CIA was the successor to the OSS, Organization for Secret Service, and its modus operandi, or rather its agenda, was international. To do espionage work, the intelligence work, on an international basis. Now, in Singapore, we don't have that luxury. So the ISA was devoted to looking after the security interests, the domestic interests of Singapore. Just that comment I make.
Okay, thanks, Alex. There are a couple more questions from Mr. Wayne. Is it true that Singapore profited from the Korean and Vietnam wars? And then are there any instances that you can think of? Maybe Kheng Soon will answer that.
Actually, in part 2, I talked about why is the sound coming back at me? Yeah, in part two, I elaborated on that, right? That the what was it? What's the question again?
Vietnam and the Korean War, how did Singapore benefit?
Oh, Korean War, 51 to 54, I think, benefited Singapore tremendously because the price of tin and rubber shot up. And because of that, there was a huge amount of money flowing into our banks in Singapore. And that was the beginning of the middle income housing boom in Singapore. So Sana Estate housing, Serangoon Garden Estate, Revolt Heights, all the housing estates for the middle class was built from that money, right? The Korean War, the Vietnam War was tremendous also. It boosted our hotel industry, right? And Singapore was a major transshipment point for weapons and other material going to Vietnam, right? So we were making tons of money, right? Actually, Singapore economy benefited a lot from other people's miseries, you know. For example, I also mentioned in my part two, right? The 1965 disposal of Sukarno and the instatement of Suharto, right? There were about, people estimate maybe about 1 million people were killed, right? Yeah, and then the Chinese money flooded into Singapore, and that actually triggered the whole urban renewal program in Singapore. The land sales program in Singapore was boosted by the amount of money that came in, right? So People's Park Complex was built because of that kind of money. Yeah.
Okay, so Wayne actually asked me to paste all his questions in the chat. Wayne, the reason why I actually broke up your question because I want to put it in a chronological order. Your first question is Singapore laser focused on pragmatic pursuits of financial wealth, yes or no? I think Kheng Soon already mentioned that LKY was a very pragmatic person. And then in the formative years of Singapore, definitely we were going after financial wealth and stability. I don't think that's a question in anybody's mind. Okay, maybe your second question. Is this the only avenue for Singapore to move forward and exist in the future? So do we want to stay laser focused on the pragmatic pursuit of financial wealth, yes or no?
Yeah, actually in my part three, we are jumping ahead, right? In part three, I talked about the new economy, right? In which, given the geopolitical contestation going on, right, and the fracturing of the global supply chain, that Singapore needs to actually be a catalyst in creating an eco-regional economy, right, in which Southeast Asia are linked together in a mutually beneficial economic arrangement, right, with huge amounts of capital that Singapore can mobilize, as well as technical and managerial capabilities, right? So this is something that is for part three, right? But my point is that unless a new an awakening of creative intellect in Singapore, right, happens, all the future will not happen.
Okay, thanks, Kheng Soon. So this Wayne is also interested in the CIA. And is Singapore involved in similar activities, stealthily servicing? You take over. Stealthily servicing the current conflicts in Ukraine. Can you read the question in the chat?
What?
The chat. Question? The last one. Is Singapore involved in similar activity?
I'm going to read the last question. Is Singapore involved in similar activities, stealthily servicing the current conflicts in Ukraine, Middle East?
Well, Singapore is an open economy, right? So, for various flows go through Singapore, right? It may not be Singapore's intention, right? But we're an open economy, so flows can come through, right? Just as flows went through to Myanmar, right, or to Vietnam, right, or to Korea. It is not impossible that there will be various kinds of financial and technical flows to other parts of the world. We are an open economy.
Okay, thanks, Prof Tay. Actually, I plan to actually sort of guide the discussion the various time periods, but you guys are jumping all over the place. So one of the questions I had for Alex actually was during the racial riots, I believe you were one of the witnesses to a person actually being killed in front of you. So maybe you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Is it okay? Yeah, mute. Okay. Oh yes, I had the fortunate enough to live through that era, very trying times, dangerous times also, because it was after the 1963 election that resolved this power struggle between the left wing and the hard left in the PAP, resulting in the return of the PAP once again in 1963 election. I base that as a starting point in what I'm going to comment on, because from that point, Malaysia Day took place, and we became a part of Malaysia, a state within the Grand Federation of Malaysia. And the politics, the domestic politics was different. It was no longer that left versus the establishment, the incumbent versus the left wing. In other words, let me put it this way: the power struggle within the PAP extended into the national level. The extreme left, they formed the partisan, and then they lost in the 63 election. Now, from that point, we were in Malaysia, and the narrative was entirely different. It was no longer left-wing communism. No, it was Malaysian Malaysia. Now, this is interesting because Lee Kuan Yew, in his good sense, he managed to resolve the problem of the left-wing threat, that potential for left-wing takeover in Singapore. In the 1963 election, everything was on the table. Then this Malaysian Malaysia concept became a battle cry for a new kind of narrative, and that was the PAP leading a grand coalition known as the Malaysian Solidarity Convention, seeking from the incumbent alliance government, the federal government in KL, for the alternative of Malaysia, which is a Malaysian Malaysia, and it became, the rhetoric was very, very racial, very racial. And there was this guy by the name of Syed Jafar Alba, who was the Secretary General of UMNO at that time, and he came to Singapore now and then to stir up the Singapore UMNO faction. The Singapore UMNO today is the SP, the Singapore Malay Party. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that he stood up and went on a crusade to appealing to the Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew for more special rights for the Malays. I mean, it's already resolved in the constitution, but he was asking for more and more of the influence into government policies. And then, unfortunately, an incident happened on Prophet Muhammad's birthday in July, and then it led to a clash between the two communities. I'm talking about the youth from the two racial groups. And it started as the kind of little disturbances, and then it led to a curfew immediately on that day, on that evening. And then the next day, the Prime Minister, of course, in the interim, he made an announcement that the next day would be a working day. There will not be any curfew, because when the disturbances started at 6 o'clock on that very day, curfew was announced by the police, and immediately the whole evening throughout the duration of the night, Singapore was in a state of curfew. Until the next morning, curfew was lifted and everybody went back to work, because that was what the Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was declaring. He was saying that the next day would be a normal day, go back to work, we have to earn a living. And then the conflagration started at around about 8 o'clock. And I was on the way to my father's office, because I was assisting my father in running his publishing business. And there was this excitement, this skirmishes, a small little skirmish and little disturbances and struggling. And at the back lane of where we were located, my office was located along Robinson Road. I'm talking about beyond that Buntat Street towards Amoy Street and Teluk Ayer Street, that part of the Chinatown. And a Malay guy was killed. And 2 Indian, well, I mean, they're reasonable enough for the 2 Indian to lend a helping hand and lifted the Malay from his very state of affair, his state of physical being. He was bloodied all over. And waiting for the police to come in. In the meanwhile, the Chinese rascals, the civil society, the gangsters, they were all around there and all watching and waiting. Now, it was quite scary. It was quite scary, and that was my experience of citing a disturbance, a skirmish of that nature.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I think Wayne has a question. Wayne, you want to ask your question?
Professor, thank you for your talk. My main concern is basically the future survival of Singapore. Now, based on my perspectives, everything here involves money, money, and money. Our society appears to have gotten intoxicated with property speculation to the extent that everybody is paying for the profits of the landlords. Now, also based on my perspectives, as you mentioned, Singapore is an open economy. There are conflicts in various regions, and war profiteers disguised as private military contractors are making a lot of money. So one would logically suspect that this type of profits may end up in Singapore, and it may benefit Singapore, it may not, I do not know. But you know, what's in it for the future of Singapore? If there are no conflicts in the Middle East or in part of Russia, what other international businesses can Singapore do? Thank you. How can our future children survive and remain relevant, considering the fact that the children from China, the children from continental India, South India, North India, they are so much more driven and so much more creative compared to our incumbent children. So this is a concern that I have for the future.
Okay, I'm going to answer you. I had a meeting with a high-up person in Temasek. Okay. My question was, what is the possibility of me raising $1 trillion? $1 trillion is 1,000 million dollars. Okay. 1,000 billion dollars. Right. And the answer given to me was, that's not a problem at all. With Singapore's AAA financial status, we can raise any amount of money, right? The only issue is who is going to use that money effectively and trustworthy, okay? And the question thrown back at me was, are there any Singaporeans who are capable of using such large sum of money to develop the region? Because my point was, we need at least $1 trillion to trigger off the eco-regional economy of Southeast Asia, right? To turn Southeast Asia into a network economy in which mutual benefits, right, will occur in all sectors, from agricultural sector to manufacturing sector, to financial sector, to real estate sector, to infrastructure development sector, and so on and so on and so on, right? And this person agreed with me completely that that is the future. But who can manage it? And to that, I confess that I don't see anybody in Singapore capable of doing it. So money is not a problem. Capability is the problem. Okay? So this is what I'm going to talk about in part 3. Because unless we make very serious efforts to liberate the creative and capability of Singaporeans, right, together with regional allies, we're done for. Because the global supply chain on which we depend entirely is fracturing, right? So this is the problem, right? But money is not a problem. There are at least $20 trillion doing nothing in the world, right? They are lying idle in offshore bank accounts, and these people who deposit money there, these are the rich and the corrupt in the whole world. They put their money in offshore accounts, right? In Bahamas, right? In Cyprus and various other countries, right? And they pay these companies, they pay these banks 0.5%. If we offer them 1%, the money will come to us, right? But can we use the money effectively? Do we have the brains to do so? That is our problem, okay? So money is not a problem. Money is not a problem. Yeah, capability is a problem. Yeah.
I mean, the answer to that is that all the talent and all the creative intellect has gone from the country. Because those who are creative enough, those who are awake, have decided it is no longer worth it to stick around. That is why.
That is one problem, but I think that also the tremendous amount of talent in Singapore, right, is I'll put it this way, it's self-censoring. We therefore dare not think big. We dare not think big because we are afraid that we are stepping on other people's feet. Yeah. So we don't think big, right? We rather think of ourselves as the rich little red dot, right? So that's the problem. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, as one of
we
my...
have a can we just we have a question from Vincent. How helpful is the appreciation of Lee Kuan Yew background as a Hakkanian to understand his personality? I just want to do a short pitch for Lee Wei Ling, because Lee Wei Ling also came out her own book, Journey of a Hakka Woman, I think it's something like that. So yeah, she also emphasized the fact that she is a Hakka. So anybody?
Can I answer that? Yeah, I answer that because I'm part Hakka myself. Like Lee Kuan Yew, my Hakka ancestors are from Guangdong Province. What you want to notice is that the founder of another very important Southeast Asian hub city, Kuala Lumpur, one of the co-founders was a Hakka from Guangdong called Yak Aloy with his Malay partner. And then there was this Hakka man who founded, I think, a kingdom in Kalimantan. Is it called Langkasuka or something? I can't remember. Langsong or something like that. And
Lanfang Republic.
Lanfang Republic, right. And the other interesting thing is a Hakka who was the president of a small Southeast American country called Guyana. And then there's a British member of parliament who's ethnic Hakka. So Hakka seem to have a penchant for doing important political things outside of China. I
Deng
attribute that to
Xiaoping,
their
Deng Xiaoping is Hakka.
yeah, Sun Zhongshan also.
Yes.
I attribute that to the migrant mentality because the Hakkas are the Jews and the Gypsies. They migrated from northern China to southern China. So they were like strangers in southern China. So when they migrate from southern China to Singapore and Malaysia, they're just continuing the Hakka trend of just moving south and south and being a stranger among other people and sometimes not being very welcome. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew has a kind of a fortress mentality. He wants to make Singapore a fortress against Malaysia and Indonesia, and I think it's the Hakka mentality. You look at all the fortress buildings in Guangdong and Fujian, against local native people who are not always very friendly to Hakkas.
I think I want to butt in. The Taiping rebellion was led by Hang Suchuan, Hakka, himself Hakka, and he almost won that the rebellion to topple the Qing dynasty under Emperor Guangxu. That was there from 1860 to
Actually, since we are talking about ethnicities, right? I think that's something that's very interesting and very important in relation to South China and Southeast Asia. Okay, it's very interesting that the southern part of China, stretching from Fujian province all the way to North Vietnam, was an area called in the north around was Minh Yet. Minh Yet was the kind of Hokkien area, right? And then the southern part was Nan Yet, right? And interestingly is that these are the Aboriginal people of South China. They had dark skin like me, right? I'm from South China, dark skin. The light-skinned people are from the north, right? The Hakka and the Han people came down. They pushed them into the south, right? So in the Minh Yet area, they were pushed into Taiwan, and then as the Han moved more and more into the plains of Taiwan, the Yet people move up into the mountains and became the Aboriginal people, right? And then they went into the southern coast of Taiwan, and then they migrated to Philippines and to Sulawesi, and then to Kalimantan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and ultimately eastwards to right across to Polynesia and westwards to Madagascar. They were the Austronesians, and the Austronesians are really from South China, and therefore the Malays, right, are actually Chinese. So this is a very important anthropological background, which I think is very important for the future discussion about the eco-regionalization of Southeast Asia, right? The division between Malays and Chinese, right, especially Southern Chinese, is actually a political division, right, rather than an ethnic division, right? And then in the north of Vietnam, the Yet people were pushed into Vietnam, right? So the southern part of the Yet was Nan Yet, right? And Nan Yet became Yet Nan became Vietnam. Okay, so this is the ethnographical anthropological basis of southern China and its relationship with Southeast Asia. So this is a narrative which I think is of importance that we can reconnect between China and Southeast Asia, right? And in fact, today I was having a very interesting discussion with somebody in Penang who is in contact with southern China, the area around Nanning, right? And there's a proposal of 3,000 acres of land to build a new settlement, right? And I propose that we should turn it into a city for new Asia, right? So that this is where Southeast Asia and China and South China and North China, right, can come together to invent what I call the new Asia model. Okay, so these are the kinds of possibilities, right, which we must dare to think about, right? And I think the time is coming very soon that we need to think beyond the developmental model which we have inherited from the West, right? We have to think about a new Asian developmental model in which political boundaries, right, are overlaid by a new economic commonwealth is a term that George Yew has used to discuss it. So what was the reaction of George Yew's mention about commonwealth, Hanshi, in China? Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is I attended George Yew's talk at Hong Kong University 2 days ago.
Yeah.
I'll give an answer that may not be very relevant to your question, but what George Yew said is that Southeast Asians are inherently promiscuous. So if a Southeast Asian country makes friends with one big power like China, it doesn't mean that they will also make friends with America and India and Japan.
Right.
So George Yew said that just because China has built a high-speed rail for Indonesia, doesn't mean that Indonesia is going to be a vassal of China, you know.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
Yeah, but the idea of a commonwealth, how was that received?
He didn't talk about the Commonwealth at the Hong Kong University talk.
Yeah, but he did mention it in some other discussion.
Yeah.
I think he mentioned it in Taiwan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I add something
Yeah, go ahead.
to what Kheng Soon is talking about, what he discussed earlier about the need in Singapore to develop entrepreneurial, innovative, creative skills. And originally, earlier, I was asked the question of what do you think about, Goh Keng Swee, who influenced him, and about his policies. Now, I think his policies worked very well for Singapore, maybe for the first 30, 40, 50 years, okay, where you bring in entrepreneurs from outside, you bring in capital from outside, innovators from outside, and you get a trained workforce over here, highly trained, very qualified, to work with them, to develop the nation. It was that kind of developmental model. But when Kheng Soon talked about, a lot of $1 trillion, but if we borrowed this $1 trillion and paid a little higher interest rate, we wouldn't know what to do with it. It's because we've been trained into this kind of a developmental model that if we can now open up space, which is going to be very difficult, because opening up space for entrepreneurs and creative innovators who can develop their own capital, and build their own enterprises would also be kind of threatening, okay, in many ways, to our system, which is very dependent on the government creating the wealth rather than a bottom-up creation of wealth. We saw the same problem faced by China. China did very well for 30 or 40 years, and now we are seeing, the political authorities in China somehow feeling, that there is a need to balance that. Okay, and this actually is also threatening entrepreneurs in certain ways in China. But we could open up because we've never really opened up that way. And this might be the way forward. I don't know what Kheng Soon thinks about this, but this is certainly going away from the Goh Keng Swee model.
Okay, I'm going to quickly interject here because Wayne has a comment rather. Can some of us here start some form of grassroots movement to realize urbanization? Now, I'm going to just quickly answer Wayne here. Actually, this part about urbanization and the involvement of ASEAN in some kind of collaboration. It's actually covered in part 3. So you're kind of jumping the gun. So please be patient. We will cover that in more detail in part 3. Your other comment about we also need to include the contributions of the Indians, North and South, as well as the Arabs, the Jews, and others who have settled in Singapore. We also had a discussion about this in Friday conversations about how SEATO actually led to BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and also now the Arabs are start coming in. So you are sort of anticipating what is the world trend, which is something like a non-aligned movement. What do you guys think about this trend? Maybe Kheng Soon?
I think that the unipolar world in which the Anglo-American order is the predominant order is breaking down, and that the multipolar world is emerging, right? And I think the BRICS is an example of this, right? Of course, the unipolar forces that be are terrified of this, and they are manipulating. For example, there's a recent threat by Argentina to break out from BRICS, and obviously they are under some kind of American pressure. America has always been very influential, influencing the politics in South America, particularly Argentina, right? And China has recently warned Argentina that there are great consequences should they leave BRICS. So I think that there will be this push and pull that will be going on for the next 10 years, right? So this is going to be the politics of the future, right? The unipolar world is not going to just die quietly, right? And the multipolar world is not going to be trouble-free either. So it's going to be a very complex world, and unless we develop some kind of a regional cooperative unity, I think that we will not be able to do well in the very much more complex world that we are going to go into. So I think that regionalism is a very important part, right? So I think that Singapore has a very important role to play, right? Provided we have the guts and we have the imagination and the daring, right? I mean, people like George Yeo, people like Mabubani, right, are already thinking way beyond the limits of our typical Singaporean point of view.
Well, I mean, China's trying to do that with the Belt and Road, and but America doesn't like it. I mean, China says it's an open and inclusive global order led by China, and America doesn't like it. And America is returning a bit to the days of John Foster Dulles, as Kheng Soon said. They're trying to push back against it.
Anybody have any other questions? If there are no more questions, can we have a group photo? I'll just ask Aldrin's help to change this to... can everybody turn on their camera, please?
I'll be taking 2 shots. So in 3, 2, 1. Another one. Another one. And another one in 3, 2, 1. Smile. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everyone. As mentioned, we have recorded the session. We should be able to upload this, maybe not this year, but maybe early next year. Just for the knowledge, we are setting up a Friday Conversation website. It's still work in progress, but hopefully we can, you guys can see something by the first half of next year. So have a good evening, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining in tonight. I hope you have learned something from tonight. Okay, good night, everyone.